They say the blood was visible before the crown even touched her head. It leaked quietly, warming the inside of her thighs beneath layers of silk. The crowd outside roared for their queen. Inside, no one noticed the slow dark stain spreading beneath the throne. Queen Mary Tudor did not flinch. She sat straight, stiff as marble, her lips pressed together beneath a trembling smile. The air inside Westminster Abbey was thick with incense and expectation. She had waited her whole life for this moment, and now her own body was undoing it. The bells were still ringing when the Archbishop stepped forward, his fingers wet with holy oil. He looked at her eyes, but not at the gown. He didn't need to. She knew it was happening again. The aching low in her stomach, the heaviness, the pressure, and now the warmth. But she said nothing. She could not say anything. Because this bleeding was supposed to be a child. For weeks, Mary had believed she was pregnant. She had felt the fluttering. She had whispered to her womb. Even the court physicians, cautious and terrified, confirmed it. "The child grows strong, Your Majesty," they told her. And Mary believed them. She had to. Because if there was no child, then what was left? She was 37. Her new husband, Philip of Spain, already treated her like a formality. The kingdom was fractured, her enemies were waiting for failure, and her crown, the first ever worn by a woman in England, was heavy with doubt. But if she gave them a son, all of it, the doubts, the rumors, the curses, would burn away. That morning, as she dressed for her coronation, she had touched her belly and smiled. A little tight, a little sore, but that meant progress, that meant promise. She had thanked God aloud, and her ladies-in-waiting repeated it softly. God bless the Queen, and God bless the child. But now as she shifted beneath the weight of royal velvet, something inside her shifted too, and not in a way that brought comfort. She felt the heat first, then the unmistakable, humiliating trickle. But Mary didn't move. She couldn't, because queens don't bleed. When the ceremony ended, she was escorted away in triumph. The people in the streets screamed her name. Petals were thrown. Trumpets blared. Inside the palace, her blood-soaked cushion was removed in silence. It was burned that night, along with the linens. No record exists of who gave the order, but everyone understood why. The next day, Mary did not leave her bed. Her stomach ached. The swelling had vanished. The nausea was gone. There was no child, just the crown on her nightstand and the smell of blood in her sheets. She didn't weep. She stared at the ceiling, and she whispered one name, not Philip, not even Jesus, but Mother. Because Mary remembered a time when her own mother, Catherine of Aragon, had bled in silence too. She remembered the way her mother had cried alone, locked out of her husband's chambers. She remembered being called bastard when her father remarried. She remembered what it felt like to be discarded because her existence had not been male. Now it was her turn. Now she was the one bleeding. Now she was the one silently erased by a body that refused to cooperate. But Mary would not yield. 3 days later, she appeared again in court, pale, dignified, silent. And when a lady asked how the child fared, she said simply, "He kicks at night." The lie was easy now, easier than shame, easier than saying the truth aloud, that God had not chosen her, that the crown had come, but the child never would. That night, alone in her chamber, she pressed both hands against her belly and whispered again, "I know you're still there. Please don't leave me too." For weeks, Queen Mary held the lie like a secret flame, close to her chest, feeding it with whispers and warmth. The court believed her, or at least pretended to. They brought gifts for the unborn prince. Nobles toasted to the future king. Priests held masses of thanks. And Mary waited. She watched her belly each morning, listened for kicks at night, placed her hands gently over the silence, and whispered lullabies to a life that refused to answer. But time passed, and her body, once swollen with imagined promise, began to shrink. Her appetite faded. The stiffness in her legs returned. Her back curved under the weight of something that was no longer there. She didn't bleed again. Not yet. That would come later. What came first was the doubt. One by one, the whispers returned. "She looks thinner, doesn't she?" There's been no movement. No physician has heard a heartbeat, but no one said it to her face. Because to question the Queen's womb was to question God's will, and Mary needed to believe this was divine. She needed to believe the blood had been a sign of strength, not the death of hope. Because if not, what did that make her? Useless? Cursed? A queen only in name, not in body? She ordered the physicians to keep examining her. She demanded silence in return. And even as the signs disappeared, she held to the belief, A child was coming. Until the day she woke up drenched in sweat, her sheets twisted, and her lower body gripped by a pain so deep she thought she had been split in half. When the midwives rushed in, they found her curled and shaking, pale as bone. There was blood again. Not much, but enough. Enough to tell the truth. There was no child. There had never been. Mary lay still for 3 days. She dismissed everyone. She would not eat, would not speak, would not look at the cushion stained beneath her. The truth had reached her bones. And then something broke. She rose on the 4th day, walked to her mirror, and saw herself. Not as a queen, not as a mother, but as a woman haunted by absence. And in that mirror, she remembered another woman who had stared into her own reflection, defeated, discarded, and full of sorrow. Her mother, Catherine of Aragon, the woman Henry VIII had cast aside like a spoiled fruit, because she could not give him a living son. The woman Mary had watched cry behind locked doors, whispering prayers to a God who never answered. The woman who bled quietly for years while England laughed. Mary clenched her fists at the glass. "I am not her," she whispered. "I will not be replaced." But in her heart, she knew the truth. She was becoming her. Only worse, because Mary had the crown now, and still the world would measure her by what she could not produce. It was during this time, while her womb fell silent and her body betrayed her, that she began to turn. First toward silence, then toward God, and finally toward vengeance. She ordered the court chaplains to prepare national prayers. But they were not for a child. They were for purification. She began to speak of heretics, of fire, of cleansing the kingdom. Her advisors hesitated, briefly. But Mary no longer listened. Not to doubt, not to mercy. Because if she could not give England a son, she would give it purity. She would give it pain. And so the orders began. Secret at first, then public, then undeniable. Men, women, children, burned at the stake, accused of Protestant sympathy, accused of rebellion, accused of believing in the wrong Christ. Mary watched from palace windows as the flames rose. She said nothing. She prayed, and in the night, she returned to her mirror, stared again, and placed her hands on her belly. "You will come," she whispered, "when England is clean, when the sins are burned." But her belly stayed flat. Her eyes stayed hollow, and her kingdom began to burn. The first man burned in silence. He did not scream. He only stared at the sky, at the Queen's banner fluttering above the square, at the priest reading the sentence in trembling Latin. His lips moved in prayer, or maybe in protest. No one was close enough to hear. When the flames reached his feet, he closed his eyes. When they swallowed his robes, he whispered one last word. Not mercy, not God, but why? Queen Mary did not attend the execution, but she approved it, signed it, and when told that the man had died quietly, she only nodded. There would be others, and there were, dozens, then hundreds. Men, women, children barely old enough to spell heresy, dragged into public squares, tied to posts, drenched in oil, and burned by the Queen's command. She called it purification. The kingdom called it fear, because fire spreads, and Mary had turned to fire to fix what her body could not. She could not carry a child, so she would carry the cross. She could not create life, so she would erase sin. But the truth was simpler, more tragic, more disturbing. Mary was trying to bleed through someone else now. Every execution, every flame, every crackling scream, it filled a void that had begun in her stomach and spread like infection into her mind. She told her confessor that the nation had to suffer, just as Christ had. She told her ladies that she still felt movement in her belly at night. She told herself that when enough heretics had burned, the child would return. But nothing returned. Only silence. Only more pain. Only ghosts. She began to dream of the child, a small figure in white, barefoot on cold stone floors, whispering from the shadows. "Mama, I'm cold." She would wake up breathless, soaked in sweat, clutching her belly as if it might still grow. She asked the priest to bless her chambers. She made them sprinkle holy water on her mirror. But the dreams didn't stop, and neither did the flames. By winter, the name Bloody Mary had already spread, not just in whispers but in pamphlets, not just in taverns but in courts abroad. England's Catholic queen, the womb that failed, the fire that didn't. She tried to ignore it. She tried to pray louder than the rumors. But even the servants had begun to fear her. They avoided her touch. They spoke only when spoken to. One courtier fainted during a banquet, not from illness, but from the stench that followed her. Something inside her was festering again. She told her physician she was pregnant. Again. The swelling was back. The tenderness, the cravings, the dreams. They nodded. They took her pulse. And they said nothing, because no one dared say the word cancer. No one dared suggest that her body wasn't building life. It was breaking itself down. Still, she insisted on preparing the nursery. A new cradle was commissioned. Seamstresses worked day and night on baby linens. A name was whispered through the halls. Edward. She said he kicked stronger than before. But in private, when the bleeding returned, she told no one. She stuffed cloths into her undergarments. She smeared perfume on her hands and wrists. She avoided mirrors. She knew. This time the child wasn't coming. This time the womb had turned against her fully. And outside the kingdom burned. One morning, she stood on a balcony above the execution square. The stake was already prepared. The condemned was a young girl, 19, barely taller than the ropes that held her, was weeping. Mary didn't blink. She stared down at the girl, at the firewood, at the rope, at the pale skin. She whispered something, too low to be heard. A servant near her claimed it sounded like, "She's lucky, hers will be quick." Then the flames were lit. By autumn of 1558, Queen Mary could barely walk. Her once stiff royal posture had collapsed into a hunch. Her hands trembled, her voice cracked, and her belly, though swollen once again, did not carry a child. It carried rot. The physicians were, now too afraid to speak plainly, called it a growth. Some whispered tumor. None dared say what everyone suspected. It was death inside her, growing. Mary still insisted she was pregnant, even as the pain left her gasping, even as blood soaked her bed linens each morning, even as the odor became too powerful to ignore. Servants began covering their faces with scented cloths. Windows were opened in winter. Perfume candles burned day and night in the Queen's chamber. But the scent still clung. It was the smell of a body decaying from within. And still she spoke of the child. "He moves at night," she whispered. "He'll be strong. He'll fix this land. I will give England a king." But there was no movement. Only fluid. Only blood. Only silence. One night, in her fevered haze, she called for her mother. Not for Philip. Not for God. For Catherine. And then, for Henry. He said I was no one. He said I was a mistake. But I am queen, aren't I? I was queen. No one answered. Not even the dying man she'd once called father. Because Henry VIII, the man who had torn Mary's life in half when she was a girl, the man who broke her mother, disinherited her, and declared her a bastard, had already won. His ghost didn't need to haunt her. His legacy already had. Her pain grew worse. She screamed in the night, sometimes from agony, sometimes from hallucinations. One servant reported hearing her whisper to the walls, "The child is in there, beneath the floor." Another swore he saw her reach toward the crown beside her bed and mutter, "Too heavy, too sharp." Her body began to fail. She could no longer eat. Her eyes yellowed. Her gums bled. Gangrene began to set into her legs. And yet the court still pretended. Because under English law, to declare the monarch dying before death was treason, so they bowed. They smiled. They spoke of the nursery, even as the Queen wept in silence and bled into the sheets. In her final hours, Archbishop Pole stood beside her. She could no longer speak. But when he asked her, "Do you die in the faith?" she squeezed his hand once, and then let go. Queen Mary died on November 17th, 1558, at the age of 42. There was no child, no heir, only the memory of screams, only the rumors of blood. Her body, too bloated and decayed, had to be embalmed in haste. The linens around her were burned. The chamber was fumigated for days. The cradle in the nursery was quietly removed. The name Edward, painted on the wall, was scrubbed away. And the crown? It was placed at the foot of her bed, not on her head. She was buried at Westminster Abbey, not beside her mother, but eventually beside the woman whose existence had once cost Mary everything, Elizabeth of Fern, her sister, Aunt Boleyn's daughter. The girl born of the woman Henry VIII killed to make way for a son, but it was Elizabeth who would rule. It was Elizabeth who would bring England glory. It was Elizabeth who would erase Mary's name from celebration and leave only the whisper, "Bloody Mary." Mary Tudor had ruled for 5 years. She changed the course of faith. She burned nearly 300 souls. She believed, until her dying breath, that she would give England a king. But she gave it nothing. Not a child. Not a legacy. Only ashes. Only smoke. Only blood. The Queen bled for a kingdom that never mourned her. She ruled through pain, and died beneath the weight of a crown no womb could carry. Her father broke her, her people feared her, and history forgot her, except for the flames.